In this video, I'm going to talk about how the two important gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange places in our respiratory system. So remember that gas exchange is the primary function of our respiratory system, and most of the structures that we identify, starting with your nose and going down through your mouth and your pharynx and trachea and bronchial tubes, are really just involved in transporting air. They're not doing anything to do this exchange of gases. That the functional unit, the place where the action really is happening, is the alveolus, which is singular, alveoli, plural. Alveoli is another way to say it, or the alveolar bundles at the end of the bronchial tubes, in the bronchioles, down in your lungs, which are surrounded by capillaries. This is where everything happens. Remember that those alveolar cells are just very, very thin. They're squamous epithelial cells. They're flat. They're creating little microscopic air pockets that allow the blood vessels that are just on the other side, here's a capillary on the other side, just so that there's very, very small distance for oxygen and carbon dioxide to move. So we need to think about where these gases are coming from. The ordinary air that we are breathing is mostly nitrogen, about 78% nitrogen, which just really doesn't do anything. It takes up space, but your body doesn't use it. 21% of the molecules in air are actually oxygen molecules, the ones that we are most concerned about, and a very small amount, 0.04%, is carbon dioxide. Now, air has mass, and it is attracted by gravity to the center of the earth, and so it is pushing on us. It has pressure. And total air pressure is typically around 760 millimeters of mercury. It's also called 1 atmosphere, and there's other ways of measuring it, pounds per square inch, but we're going to focus on this millimeters of mercury. Each of the gases that are present in air, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and there's a smattering of other gases as well, each one contributes to the total pressure, and the piece that they contribute is known as its partial pressure. So the 21% of oxygen in the air has a partial pressure of about 160 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide has a partial pressure of about 0.3 millimeters of mercury. And this air pressure is what causes gases to dissolve in liquids. And as if you remember from the previous video, in order for the oxygen to be taken up by the hemoglobin in your blood, the gas has to move from the air inside your lungs into the liquid that's lining those little alveoli sacs, and through the liquid, the gas then will eventually make its way into the blood cells. So gases diffuse after they get dissolved in the liquid. They diffuse across cell membranes because of differences in partial pressures. So the partial pressures are creating a concentration gradient, and the gases will move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration by diffusion. Diffusion is a type of passive transport. There is no ATP needed. It'll just happen. And the higher the concentration is, the faster diffusion will occur. So this diagram is just showing the edge of the alveoli and the capillary that's going to be running along right beside it, and is taking a look at these partial pressures. Now, even though the oxygen in the air is about 160 millimeters of mercury, remember there's some residual air always present in our lungs, and it's going to have kind of a lower level of oxygen, higher level of carbon dioxide. So as the air coming in mixes, we end up with about 104 millimeters of mercury being the partial pressure of oxygen inside your lungs. But that is still much higher than the partial pressure of oxygen that is in the veins of the blood coming into the capillary bed, because that's only 40 millimeters of mercury. So again, your concentration gradient is going to cause the oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillaries, into the bloodstream. And in the opposite direction, our carbon dioxide level in the blood is about 45 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide present in the lungs, sitting there in the air sacs, is about 40, so it's not as big of a difference, but there still is enough of a difference to cause diffusion to occur out of the bloodstream and into the air pockets of the lungs. And so when you have had the diffusion happen, we're taking the blood that is oxygenated now, that is flowing to body cells, has a partial pressure of about 104 millimeters of mercury for oxygen and 40 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide. So how are we carrying this oxygen? Well, I think you already know that oxygen is carried by hemoglobin molecules found in red blood cells. And hemoglobin is a protein with a special part that has an iron atom, and the iron atom is involved in the molecule that's known as heme. So the heme part of hemoglobin is what connects to the oxygen. It binds to the oxygen and hangs on to those oxygen molecules. And most of the oxygen that is being transported in the blood, about 98%, is bound to the hemoglobin molecule, to the heme portion. A tiny, tiny bit does dissolve in plasma. Because each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules, there's actually 8 atoms of oxygen, because oxygen is O2. Now, these hemoglobin or heme oxygen bond connections are not particularly strong, and so they're able to break when the red blood cells reach our body tissues and oxygen is sort of drawn out because, again, differences in concentration to diffuse out of the blood. But really only about 25% of what's being carried will move into body tissues at any one time. Most of the oxygen remains bound to the hemoglobin, which has a couple of positive things about it, and continues to circulate around the blood. That is why you can hold your breath and you don't, immediately faint, because there still is oxygen in your blood that can move out of the bloodstream into your body cells, even if you aren't breathing in new air. There are certain things that will encourage the oxygen to be released from the hemoglobin. As the acidity of the blood rises, which will happen if carbon dioxide is moving into the blood, because carbon dioxide plus water makes carbonic acid, and so the blood will become slightly more acid, which allows more oxygen to be released. Or if the blood temperature goes up, more oxygen will be released. So as an automatic effect of exercise, more carbon dioxide being produced and put into the bloodstream, higher body temperature because the muscles are exercising, both of those things work to encourage more oxygen to move into body cells. So it balances out. Your need for oxygen is going to automatically be supplied because your body responds to these two changes. So here again, a little diagram showing that our oxygen molecules that were present in the air will be picked up by hemoglobin molecules by diffusion, and they travel in what's known as an oxyhemoglobin. So that's your oxygenated blood. When we get over here to our body cells in our tissues, the blood or the oxygen will move off the hemoglobin into the cells because there's a difference in the millimeters of mercury. There is some mixing of venous blood, so it goes at the lungs, it's going in at 104 millimeters of mercury, and then the partial pressure of oxygen by the time it reaches tissues is 95. But that's still much bigger than the partial pressure of oxygen inside body tissues, which runs at an average of about 40 millimeters of mercury. So again, the drive is to move this oxygen into body cells because the concentration gradient is going to cause diffusion from the bloodstream into your body tissues. So oxygen moves out of the bloodstream into body cells, and in an exchange situation, your carbon dioxide will move out of your body tissues into the bloodstream so it can be taken to the lungs and removed from the body. The process is still based on partial pressure differences. There's a higher concentration in body tissue than there is in the bloodstream, so carbon dioxide will move into the bloodstream, move down that concentration gradient, and it's carried in 3 different ways. A larger amount of carbon dioxide than oxygen is carried, actually dissolved in plasma, in that liquid component of the blood. Another chunk of carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin, but it's not carried by the heme part. It's actually carried by amine groups, nitrogen and hydrogen. Remember, NH2 is an amine group. So the amine groups that are part of the globin part of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is actually able to carry oxygen on the way to body tissues and carbon dioxide on the way out because the 2 different molecules connect in 2 different places in that hemoglobin molecule, so they don't compete for the same space. But most of your carbon dioxide actually is traveling through your bloodstream in the form of a bicarbonate ion. So it reacts with the water that's part of the plasma to form carbonic acid, which then falls apart into bicarbonate ions. And hydrogen actually is also carried by the hemoglobin. The bicarbonate ion is really important to stabilize blood pH, because as that carbon dioxide from active cells is getting dumped into the bloodstream, the pH will tend to drop because of the production of carbonic acid, and the bicarbonate ion then helps buffer that. It helps to keep the pH more neutral. When blood cells reach the alveoli and in the lungs, they're the reverse reaction. So the bicarbonate ions will turn back into carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the plasma to be exhaled out of the body. So here's a diagram showing that process, that our tissue level of carbon dioxide is about 45 millimeters of mercury. But then in the bloodstream, the carbon dioxide level, 40 millimeters of mercury. And even though that's not a huge difference, it is enough of a concentration gradient difference that the carbon dioxide is going to move into the bloodstream. Some of that will dissolve into the plasma. Some of it will be picked up by hemoglobin. And so when carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin, we have carbaminohemoglobin, so it has its own name for that. But most of the carbon dioxide will go through this chemical reaction where carbon dioxide and water combine to form carbonic acid, and then that breaks down into the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen, which then is combined with hemoglobin and carried along, and the bicarbonate ion will be carried by the plasma. The end result being, once we've gone through this whole process, that we basically have equalized out our carbon dioxide levels, so it's about 45 millimeters of mercury in the veins, on its way to the lungs, where that process will release carbon dioxide from the bicarbonate ion and allow you to exhale it out of the body. So check your understanding. Can you explain the conditions that cause oxygen or carbon dioxide to move out of the ordinary air and into the blood or into the body cells? What is the driving force behind that movement of gases? Also, do you remember how hemoglobin can carry oxygen and carbon dioxide at the same time? And what are the 3 factors that influence how much oxygen is released from the hemoglobin in the blood into the body cells so it can be used? If you don't remember, go back and rewatch this video so you'll be prepared for the quiz.